The restricted international arrivals terminal at the major hub lay shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence at 3:00 a.m. It was a cavernous, dimly lit corridor where the sterile, artificial atmosphere felt entirely devoid of human warmth. A series of brightly colored welcome home banners hung limply from the ceiling, their cheerful messages rendered hollow and mocking in the eerie, empty expanse. The thick, stagnant air was laced with the sharp, acidic scent of industrial floor cleaner and the heavy, lingering fumes of burnt jet fuel from the tarmac just beyond the reinforced glass. In this desolate purgatory between foreign soil and domestic safety, shadows stretched long and menacing across the polished linoleum. It was an environment perfectly suited for secrets, a secluded checkpoint where absolute authority could be wielded without the inconvenient scrutiny of the general public's watchful eyes. Pacing this desolate stretch of border control was Customs and Border Protection Officer Derek Miller, a man who treated his badge as a weapon rather than a shield. At 31 years old, Miller possessed a history of disciplinary issues rooted in his terrifyingly excessive zeal. His dark blue uniform was tailored deliberately tight to showcase his recent gym progress, complementing a severe, buzzed haircut and a permanent sneer of paranoid suspicion. He rhythmically tapped a heavy metal flashlight against his palm, the dull thud echoing like a sinister metronome through the quiet terminal. Miller desperately believed he was the indispensable thin blue line protecting the nation from hostile threats. In reality, he was a deeply insecure bully who aggressively compensated for his own profound lack of genuine achievement by viewing every exhausted traveler as an automatic, dangerous enemy of the state. Emerging from the shadowy jetway like a specter was Master Chief Marcus "Ghost" Vance, a high-level Navy SEAL Tier 1 operator returning from the absolute brink of hell. Vance looked profoundly exhausted, his face gaunt and shadowed by a thick week's worth of graying stubble. He wore rugged, dusty, and entirely nondescript civilian tactical gear that bore the invisible scars of his recent deployment. Slung across his broad shoulder was a locked, titanium-reinforced diplomatic pouch, the singular reason he had just survived a brutal 72-hour extraction mission in a highly hostile Iranian border zone. Physically spent, but mentally hyper-alert, Vance radiated the unmistakable aura of a quiet professional. He possessed no desire for conflict or recognition. He simply wanted to deliver his heavily classified cargo, clear customs, and finally see his family after months of agonizing, perilous silence. Spotting the dusty, rugged traveler, Miller's predatory instincts instantly flared, his toxic prejudice blinding him to the obvious signs of a military operator. He aggressively stepped into Vance's path, utilizing his heavy flashlight to block the corridor and demand a random secondary screening. Vance complied with a weary sigh, handing over his passport, which was filled with a dizzying array of complex entry stamps from incredibly hostile global regions. Miller's eyes narrowed maliciously as he examined the heavily weathered document and then locked onto the secured titanium pouch. "Let me guess, a souvenir?" Miller mocked, his voice dripping with condescending venom. "Just how much did the Iranians actually pay a guy like you to smuggle this illegal contraband into my country?" The accusation was absurd, a deliberate, aggressive provocation designed to instantly humiliate a man who had sacrificed everything for the nation. Vance remained a monument of absolute composure, refusing to rise to the juvenile, insulting bait dangled before him. He looked directly into Miller's aggressive eyes and calmly stated he was operating under a level red Department of Defense courier mission. He politely but firmly explained that federal law strictly prohibited him from surrendering the classified pouch to civilian port authorities under any circumstances. Instead of recognizing protocol, Miller's fragile ego interpreted this factual statement as a direct, unacceptable threat to his absolute local authority. With a sudden explosive surge of unwarranted violence, Miller lunged forward and brutally tackled the exhausted SEAL. He slammed Vance's weary body hard against the cold concrete wall, violently wrenching his arms backward to apply heavy steel handcuffs, while screaming hysterical, unhinged accusations of domestic terrorism and high treason into the echoing, empty arrivals terminal. The heavy titanium pouch clattered loudly onto the polished linoleum floor, its complex internal security mechanisms instantly registering the violent, unauthorized physical impact. Pinned aggressively against the unforgiving concrete wall, Vance did not struggle, panic, or shout in frantic protest. He simply closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second. The profound emotional weight of the tragic moment settled heavily over the sterile corridor. The silent warrior who had repeatedly risked his life in the dangerous shadows was now being violently treated as an alien threat by the very borders he actively bled to secure. Miller panted heavily with a sickening, triumphant surge of adrenaline. Thoroughly convinced he had apprehended a master terrorist, he remained completely oblivious to the catastrophic federal storm he had just recklessly summoned to this quiet terminal. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. The harsh fluorescent lights of the cold interrogation room buzzed with an irritating, relentless frequency that mirrored the rapidly escalating tension. Master Chief Marcus Vance sat rigidly in a bolted metal chair, his wrists secured painfully tight behind his back with heavy steel handcuffs. The stark, windowless concrete walls felt more oppressive than the hostile desert caves he had just escaped. A cruel irony that tested his legendary patience. Officer Derek Miller paced the small, suffocating space like a caged predator. His chest puffed out in a pathetic display of unearned dominance. He repeatedly slammed his heavy metal flashlight against his open palm, attempting to physically intimidate a man who had stared down absolute death on a daily basis. The profound silence of the room was heavy, thick with the poisonous arrogance of a local bully mistakenly believing he had finally cornered a massive, dangerous international threat. Beneath his dusty, rugged exterior, Vance fought a silent, agonizing battle against the crushing weight of profound physical and mental exhaustion. Just 48 hours prior, he had been buried in a freezing, hostile Iranian border trench, shielding this very diplomatic pouch from relentless enemy gunfire. He had survived entirely on pure adrenaline and the desperate, burning desire to see his young daughters smile after months of terrifying, classified silence. Now, sitting in a sterile room in his own country, the bitter taste of betrayal mixed with the grit still clinging to his tactical gear. He was not angry at the physical pain of the handcuffs. He was deeply, profoundly heartbroken by the devastating realization that the very gates he had sacrificed his entire life to defend were currently being guarded by men utterly devoid of basic honor, respect, or fundamental human decency. Across the small table, Officer Miller was completely consumed by a toxic, blinding cocktail of deep-seated insecurity and desperate, arrogant ambition. His personnel file was a disastrous, embarrassing collection of formal reprimands for excessive force and blatant racial profiling, a career constantly hanging by a remarkably thin thread. This middle-of-the-night apprehension was his desperate, twisted bid for ultimate redemption, a chance to finally prove to his superiors that his aggressive, uncompromising methods were entirely justified. He desperately needed Vance to be a dangerous, high-level smuggler, because the terrifying alternative would completely destroy the fragile, manufactured reality where Miller was an indispensable national hero. His massive ego operated as an impenetrable blindfold, aggressively filtering out every obvious visual cue that the exhausted, quiet man sitting calmly before him was actually a highly decorated military asset operating under the highest levels of federal security clearance. Resting ominously in the center of the scratched aluminum table was the locked, titanium-reinforced diplomatic pouch, an object of immense, classified gravity. The metallic surface still bore the fresh, violent scuff marks from Miller's entirely unjustified tackle in the arrivals corridor just moments before. Miller stared at the highly secured container with a greedy, feverish intensity, utterly convinced it held massive quantities of illicit contraband or stolen state secrets. He leaned aggressively over the table, bringing his face uncomfortably close to Vance's calm, weathered features, attempting to force a terrified confession. He maliciously taunted the silent warrior, threatening to permanently lock him away in a dark federal prison where nobody would ever hear from him again. The stark, glaring contrast between Miller's crisp, spotless uniform and Vance's deeply blood-stained, dusty tactical jacket highlighted the profound, tragic divide between performative authority and genuine, agonizing sacrifice. Despite the relentless, aggressive barrage of juvenile insults and completely baseless accusations, Vance maintained an eerie, almost supernatural level of disciplined silence. He expertly analyzed Officer Miller not as a terrifying, insurmountable enemy, but as a deeply flawed, incredibly dangerous liability to the nation's internal security framework. The SEAL's dark, exhausted eyes tracked the customs officer's erratic, angry pacing, calculating the exact level of desperate, unpredictable panic simmering just beneath the surface. Vance had successfully negotiated with ruthless warlords and incredibly hostile foreign combatants, yet he found this petty, arrogant domestic tyrant to be uniquely exhausting and profoundly disappointing. He recognized that Miller's aggressive bullying behavior was entirely rooted in a pathetic, desperate need to feel powerful over someone else. The absolute tragedy of the situation was that this deeply insecure man was actively attempting to destroy the very shield that protected his own freedom. Infuriated by the profound, unshakable calm radiating from his captive, Miller abruptly slammed both of his heavy fists onto the aluminum table. The loud, metallic crash echoed violently in the small, sterile room, a pathetic, desperate attempt to shatter the Tier 1 operator's legendary discipline. "You think you can just sit there and ignore me, you treacherous piece of garbage?" Miller screamed, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. He aggressively pointed a shaking finger directly at the classified titanium pouch, wildly accusing Vance of committing high treason and facilitating international terrorism against the United States. He explicitly promised to utterly destroy Vance's life, to strip away his freedom, and to ensure he never saw his family ever again. The escalating, unhinged volume of Miller's voice only served to further expose his profound, terrifying incompetence and his complete, absolute loss of professional control. The heavy, suffocating silence that immediately followed Miller's unhinged, screaming outburst was finally, deliberately broken by the quiet, resonant voice of the warrior. Vance slowly lifted his head, locking his dark, intensely focused eyes directly onto the frantic, sweating face of the arrogant customs officer. "Officer, I just spent 3 days in a hole so you could sleep safely in your bed," Vance stated, his voice incredibly low, steady, and chillingly devoid of fear. "You have exactly 5 minutes to call the number on that manifest before your career becomes a footnote in a massive federal lawsuit." The dialogue did not carry the desperate, frantic pitch of a cornered, guilty criminal. It carried the absolute, crushing weight of a man holding an incredibly destructive truth. It was a final, remarkably merciful warning offered by a true professional to a completely clueless, reckless amateur. For a brief, agonizing fraction of a second, a cold, terrifying flicker of genuine doubt managed to pierce through Miller's thick, arrogant armor. The sheer, unadulterated conviction in Vance's steady voice was incredibly unsettling, directly challenging the fragile, manufactured reality the officer had so desperately constructed. However, Miller's massive, deeply fragile ego violently rejected the sudden influx of rational fear, instinctively forcing him to aggressively triple down on his catastrophic mistake. He let out a loud, incredibly forced bark of mocking laughter, desperately attempting to dismiss the grave, serious warning as an incredibly pathetic, elaborate bluff. To openly admit that he had violently assaulted and illegally detained a high-level military operator would mean facing immediate, severe criminal charges and the permanent, humiliating end of his entire career. He stubbornly chose to embrace his own destructive delusion, actively sealing his own terrible, inescapable professional fate. Driven by a frantic, terrifyingly irrational need to definitively prove his absolute superiority, Miller made the incredibly reckless decision to illegally breach the container. He marched aggressively toward a heavy metal lockbox mounted on the concrete wall, swiftly retrieving a set of heavy-duty industrial pry bars and bolt cutters. He was entirely consumed by the desperate, blinding desire to aggressively crack open the titanium diplomatic pouch and expose the illicit, treasonous secrets he stubbornly believed were hidden inside. His hands were shaking slightly, with a dangerous mixture of aggressive adrenaline and deeply buried, unacknowledged fear as he approached the scratched aluminum table. He was no longer acting as a sworn officer of the law. He was operating as a terrified, cornered bully desperately searching for any possible justification for his incredibly violent, highly illegal, and completely unauthorized actions against an exhausted, innocent American hero. Observing the heavy steel tools in the frantic officer's trembling hands, Vance issued one final, incredibly calm and precise verbal warning. He methodically explained that the titanium container was fully protected by a highly classified, Level Red Department of Defense active security protocol. He clearly articulated that any aggressive, Unauthorized physical tampering with the complex biometric locking mechanism would instantly trigger a massive, catastrophic federal response. He was attempting to save the incredibly arrogant officer from his own profound stupidity, offering a clear, logical path away from absolute, irreversible disaster. Vance's voice remained entirely level, completely free of any desperate pleading or angry, emotional escalation, a stark contrast to Miller's heavy, erratic breathing. The veteran SEAL knew intimately how the automated, highly encrypted defense systems operated, and he clearly understood the devastating, massive tactical storm that was about to be unleashed upon this quiet airport. Completely blinded by his toxic arrogance, Miller completely ignored the clear, factual warning, roughly wedging the heavy steel pry bar beneath the titanium latch. With a loud, desperate grunt of aggressive exertion, he violently forced the metal tool downward, attempting to physically shatter the highly sophisticated, encrypted locking mechanism. The moment the hardened steel aggressively compromised the sensitive internal circuitry, a sharp, electronic click echoed loudly inside the small, sterile interrogation room. While no loud, blaring sirens immediately sounded in the cold space, a tiny, previously invisible red LED light on the pouch began to pulse with a rapid, frantic heartbeat. The severe physical tampering had instantly activated the container's highly classified, deeply embedded distress beacon, successfully initiating a silent, deeply encrypted emergency broadcast directly across completely secure military satellite networks. The point of absolutely no return had been aggressively, foolishly, and permanently crossed. Miles away from the quiet, isolated airport terminal, deep within the highly secure, heavily fortified depths of the Pentagon's Global Command Center, alarms instantly blared. A massive, glowing digital map of the eastern seaboard suddenly flashed with a bright, urgent crimson indicator directly over the international transit hub. Highly trained, incredibly focused defense technicians immediately scrambled, quickly verifying the unique, encrypted digital signature of Master Chief Vance's critical, level-red diplomatic pouch. The sudden, unauthorized breach of a Tier 1 operator's secure asset during a highly sensitive dark move instantly triggered an immediate, massive Priority 1 response protocol. Within absolute seconds of Miller's incredibly foolish, violent action, direct, urgent lines of communication were forcefully established with the Joint Special Operations Command. The terrifying, immense, and completely overwhelming power of the entire United States military apparatus suddenly focused entirely on one specific, locked concrete room. Outside the heavily reinforced concrete walls of the isolated interrogation room, the quiet, desolate atmosphere of the terminal was suddenly, abruptly shattered. The airport's senior director of security, an experienced, highly professional man who had been urgently alerted by the initial violent scuffle, rushed down the corridor. He arrived breathlessly at the heavy steel door, aggressively pounding his fist against the solid metal surface while loudly demanding an immediate, clear explanation. He had personally reviewed the initial, highly restricted flight manifests and strongly suspected that a massive, catastrophic breach of federal protocol was actively unfolding. He yelled Miller's name repeatedly through the thick, impenetrable door, his voice echoing loudly with a deep, rising sense of genuine, terrifying administrative panic. The director desperately understood that unauthorized interference with high-level federal couriers carried severe, devastating, and entirely inescapable legal consequences for the entire airport facility. Hearing the frantic, commanding shouts of the senior director echoing through the heavy steel door, Miller experienced a sudden, massive spike of pure panic. Instead of realizing his mistake and opening the door to seek help, his deeply ingrained toxic stubbornness forced him to aggressively double down. He swiftly reached out and violently threw the heavy interior deadbolt, securely locking himself completely inside the small, sterile room with the exhausted military operator. He was absolutely committed to his destructive, paranoid delusion, completely convinced that he just needed a few more desperate minutes to fully crack the secured pouch. By forcefully locking the heavy metal door, Miller effectively isolated himself from any possible salvation, essentially trapping himself inside a concrete cage with a man who was trained to survive the most incredibly dangerous, highly volatile, and absolutely terrifying combat environments on the entire planet. Standing helplessly in the cold, dimly lit corridor, The panicked director looked down and noticed a heavily weathered, incredibly complex document lying on the floor. It was the specific, highly classified customs declaration form that had violently fallen from Vance's tactical pocket during the aggressive, entirely unjustified initial tackle. As the director quickly scanned the highly restricted Department of Defense authorization codes and the specific level red clearance markings, his face turned absolutely white. He instantly realized the full, terrifying magnitude of Miller's colossal, incredibly stupid mistake. The arrogant officer had not apprehended a dangerous, illegal smuggler. Miller had violently assaulted, illegally detained, and was actively holding a highly decorated, incredibly lethal American hero completely hostage inside a federal facility. The director frantically grabbed his heavy radio, desperately attempting to contact local authorities, completely unaware that the situation was already entirely out of their jurisdiction. Before the panicked director could even begin to broadcast his desperate, urgent plea for massive local police assistance, the entire airport's infrastructure suddenly shifted. The standard, bright, fluorescent terminal lights abruptly flickered and died, immediately replaced by the harsh, intense, and deeply ominous glow of red emergency security lighting. The automated, highly sophisticated central computer systems had been forcefully overridden from an external, incredibly powerful federal source, initiating a complete, absolute facility-wide security lockdown. Heavy, reinforced steel security gates automatically slammed shut across every major terminal corridor, loudly trapping confused, terrified maintenance workers and completely sealing off all external exits. The massive, complex transit hub was no longer operating as a civilian public transportation facility. It had been abruptly, forcefully transformed into a highly restricted, completely locked down, and heavily fortified tactical zone under the absolute, direct control of the United States military. The terrifying, massive escalation extended far beyond the immediate physical confines of the heavily locked down, glowing red international arrivals terminal. High above the facility, the regional air traffic control tower received a sudden, incredibly urgent, and absolutely undeniable direct directive from the Federal Aviation Administration. Every single commercial flight approaching the massive hub was immediately, forcefully diverted to alternative landing strips, completely clearing the immediate, surrounding airspace of all civilian traffic. Ground crews were urgently ordered to abandon their vehicles and immediately seek secure shelter indoors as the entire, sprawling tarmac was completely, forcefully cleared of all civilian personnel. The external physical tension reached an absolute terrifying peak as the massive, incredibly busy transportation center violently ground to a sudden, complete, and highly unnatural halt. The stage was now perfectly, completely set for an overwhelming, massive, and highly aggressive federal tactical intervention. Inside the small, heavily locked interrogation room, the abrupt, sudden shift to harsh red emergency lighting finally managed to pierce Miller's thick, arrogant delusion. The heavy, oppressive silence of the completely locked-down airport pressed aggressively against the concrete walls, an incredibly terrifying indicator of the massive incoming storm. He looked down at the heavily scratched titanium pouch, finally noticing the rapid, frantic pulsing of the tiny, previously ignored red distress beacon light. The heavy steel pry bar suddenly slipped from his deeply trembling, sweaty hands, clattering loudly and pathetically onto the cold, unforgiving linoleum floor. The crushing, undeniable weight of his catastrophic, highly illegal mistake finally began to aggressively suffocate him, replacing his toxic, blinding pride with a deep, incredibly primal terror. He slowly backed away from the table, his wide, fearful eyes frantically darting around the small, inescapable, red-lit concrete cage. Sitting perfectly still in the bolted metal chair, Master Chief Vance calmly watched the arrogant, deeply insecure customs officer completely and utterly unravel. The exhausted SEAL did not smile, gloat, or offer any incredibly petty, unnecessary verbal insults. He simply observed the natural devastating consequences of completely unchecked ego. The profound, emotional transformation in the sterile room was incredibly stark. The man who had aggressively claimed absolute authority was now trembling with pure, unadulterated fear. Vance took a slow, incredibly deep breath, fully accepting the incoming massive tactical response that was now absolutely, entirely unavoidable, due to Miller's actions. The Pentagon intervention was no longer just a calm, verbal threat or a highly unlikely possibility. It was a rapidly approaching, incredibly loud, and deeply physical reality. The quiet, profound silence before the storm had arrived, completely sealing the arrogant officer's devastating, inescapable professional fate. The deafening rhythmic thud of heavy military rotors suddenly shattered the unnatural silence of the locked-down terminal. Outside the reinforced glass of the arrivals hall, the night sky was violently disrupted by the sudden, aggressive appearance of two MH-6 Little Bird helicopters. They flared aggressively onto the restricted tarmac, their powerful downdrafts sending loose debris and luggage carts scattering across the concrete like weightless toys. This was not a standard police response or a quiet administrative inquiry. This was the raw, unadulterated physical manifestation of the Pentagon's absolute fury. The heavy, vibration-proof windows of the massive airport building began to rattle violently within their thick metal frames, a terrifying testament to the overwhelming tactical force descending upon the facility. The promised storm had finally arrived, completely eclipsing the petty, localized authority that had recklessly summoned it into existence. Inside the small, red-lit interrogation room, the overwhelming, terrifying roar of the incoming helicopters resonated directly through the thick concrete floors. Officer Miller stumbled backward, his hands instinctively covering his ears as the absolute, crushing reality of his catastrophic mistake finally destroyed his arrogant delusion. The heavy metallic vibrations violently shook the scratched aluminum table, rattling the dropped steel pry bar against the cold linoleum with a sickening, mocking rhythm. In stark, dramatic contrast to the customs officer's frantic, hyperventilating panic, Master Chief Vance remained seated in perfect, statuesque stillness. The exhausted Tier 1 operator was the calm, silent eye of this rapidly escalating hurricane, his dark eyes calmly watching the terrified bully completely unravel. The power dynamic within the sterile, claustrophobic cage had instantly, irreversibly flipped, transferring absolute control from the foolish captor to the deeply patient, silent captive. The grim-faced, heavily armed JSOC operators did not politely knock on the heavy steel door, nor did they waste precious seconds asking the panicked airport director for a master key. A specialized, highly concentrated breaching charge was swiftly affixed directly to the interrogation room's reinforced locking mechanism with terrifying, practiced military precision. The subsequent, localized explosion violently ripped the heavy metal door completely off its solid steel hinges, sending a massive, blinding cloud of concrete dust and thick smoke billowing into the confined space. Before the heavy, twisted metal could even clatter against the floor, 6 elite tactical operators aggressively flooded the small room. Their suppressed rifles were immediately raised, cutting through the thick, swirling dust with blinding tactical lights and precise, unblinking red laser sights that completely illuminated the terrified, frozen figure of the deeply arrogant customs officer. Moving with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency that made local police tactics look like a disorganized child's game, the JSOC team completely swarmed the small interrogation room. They aggressively bypassed the trembling, paralyzed figure of Officer Miller, instantly forming an impenetrable, protective tactical perimeter directly around the seated Master Chief. A frantic, heavily sweating United States attorney pushed his way through the shattered doorway, his expensive suit covered in the fine, gray concrete dust of the explosive breach. He looked at the bruised, handcuffed national hero and then glared at the pathetic, cowering customs officer with a look of absolute, unadulterated legal disgust. The overwhelming, highly coordinated federal presence completely suffocated any remaining shred of Miller's fabricated local authority, instantly transforming his previously intimidating domain into the highly active, incredibly dangerous ground zero of a massive, unprecedented national security crisis. Stepping through the violently shattered doorway with a calm, commanding presence that parted the heavily armed tactical operators, like the sea, a tall, imposing military figure entered the room. It was the 4-star general's personal aide-de-camp, dressed in a pristine, razor-sharp dress uniform that stood in stark, profound contrast to the chaotic, dusty aftermath of the aggressive breach. He completely ignored the pathetic, hyperventilating customs officer cowering against the concrete wall, focusing his intense, respectful gaze entirely on the exhausted SEAL sitting in the bolted metal chair. The high-ranking military official did not bark orders or demand explanations. He simply reached into his polished jacket pocket and produced a specialized federal master key. It was a profound, deeply symbolic gesture, representing the absolute highest levels of the United States government personally intervening to correct a localized, deeply shameful injustice. With a quiet, respectful efficiency, the aide-de-camp stepped behind the seated warrior and gently inserted the master key into the heavy, biting steel restraints. As the incredibly tight handcuffs finally clicked open and fell away, he took a deliberate step back and snapped a crisp, razor-sharp salute to the exhausted Tier 1 operator. It was the ultimate, undeniable power shift, a profound display of absolute reverence that completely shattered the lingering remnants of the arrogant officer's toxic, prejudiced narrative. Master Chief Vance slowly stood up from the bolted chair, his rugged, dusty tactical gear looking infinitely more honorable than Miller's tight, performative uniform. He quietly rubbed his raw, bruised wrists, his quiet, unshakable dignity radiating through the dusty room and completely overshadowing the pathetic, whimpering bully who had so recklessly and foolishly attempted to completely destroy his highly decorated life. As the deeply respected hero was finally freed, two massive, heavily armored federal operators aggressively converged on the trembling, thoroughly defeated figure of Officer Miller. They forcefully grabbed his arms, aggressively pinning him backward against the cold concrete wall with a physical intensity that made his previous, unjustified tackle look pathetic. The furious U.S. attorney stepped directly into Miller's personal space, his face flushed with a righteous, uncompromising legal fury that promised absolute, inescapable ruin. Without reading him his rights or offering any polite explanation, the attorney forcefully stripped Miller of his heavy duty belt, his service sidearm, and the silver badge he had so violently abused. The physical removal of his fabricated, completely unearned authority was swift and incredibly humiliating, publicly reducing the self-appointed guardian of the gates to a helpless, thoroughly disgraced suspect in a massive federal investigation. The absolute, crushing realization of his catastrophic, entirely self-inflicted ruin finally washed over Miller as the heavy, cold federal restraints were aggressively ratcheted around his own trembling wrists. He stared at the locked, titanium-reinforced diplomatic pouch resting safely in the hands of the elite JSOC operators, finally understanding the true, terrifying magnitude of his incredibly arrogant mistake. He hadn't heroically apprehended a dangerous, illegal foreign smuggler. He had violently assaulted and illegally detained a highly decorated critical national asset on a mission of vital security. The devastating, inescapable weight of impending treason charges, massive civil rights violations, and decades in a dark federal penitentiary settled heavily onto his shaking shoulders. The arrogant bully had finally been unmasked, his toxic prejudice leading him directly into a devastating, completely irreversible professional and personal apocalypse that he alone had aggressively orchestrated. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. Master Chief Marcus Vance was escorted out of the devastated international terminal not as a suspected criminal, but with the profound, unyielding honors reserved for a conquering hero. The heavily armed JSOC operators formed a tight, deeply respectful protective corridor, leading the exhausted Tier 1 operator toward a waiting, specialized federal transport vehicle idling on the restricted tarmac. The sealed, titanium-reinforced diplomatic pouch remained entirely secure in his grasp, its highly classified contents completely safe from the toxic, unchecked arrogance of the local authorities. The massive, highly publicized Pentagon intervention immediately sparked a comprehensive, uncompromising federal overhaul of how high-level, dark-move military couriers were legally handled at civilian ports of entry. Strict, unforgiving new protocols were rapidly implemented nationwide, ensuring that the critical, silent sacrifices made by elite operators would never again be recklessly jeopardized by incompetent, localized egos. The devastating, highly publicized downfall of Officer Derek Miller served as a terrifying, absolute warning to any law enforcement official who dared to weaponize their badge. He was permanently stripped of his uniform and aggressively prosecuted under the severe, uncompromising statutes of the National Security Act, alongside multiple crushing felony charges for massive civil rights violations. The federal judge presiding over his highly anticipated trial noted that Miller had not only assaulted an innocent citizen, but had actively, maliciously threatened the operational security of the entire United States military. Miller was sentenced to decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary, his fabricated, aggressive persona completely and utterly destroyed by the immense, crushing weight of federal justice. His disgraceful, entirely self-inflicted ruin became a permanent, glaring stain on his department, a dark legacy born entirely from his blinding, toxic prejudice. Leaving the sterile, chaotic airport far behind, Vance finally arrived at his quiet suburban home just as the warm, golden light of dawn broke. The front door swung open, and his young daughter sprinted across the lawn, throwing her arms around the exhausted warrior in a tearful, deeply emotional reunion that made his grueling Iranian deployment worthwhile. As he held her tightly, breathing in the scent of home, a television playing softly in the living room broadcasted a breaking national news report. The anchor spoke in a serious, measured tone about the newly established Miller precedent, a groundbreaking federal mandate ensuring no returning service member would ever be unlawfully profiled or harassed again. Vance closed his eyes, finally at peace, knowing his silent, agonizing endurance in that cold room had successfully shielded future generations of elite operators. Several years later, the once exhausted SEAL walked confidently through the bustling halls of the Department of Homeland Security Training Academy as a highly respected senior consultant. He personally oversaw the rigorous, uncompromising instruction of a young, incredibly diverse group of new customs recruits, dedicating his post-military life to completely reforming the broken system. Shaking hands with the eager trainees, Vance emphasized with profound, quiet conviction that the federal badge is a sacred tool for public protection, not a blunt weapon for personal prejudice. True service knows no color, and true justice knows absolutely no ego. Those who proudly guard the nation's gates must first learn to deeply respect those who bravely defend its walls. The story of the quiet operator and the arrogant bully concludes with a permanent, inspiring victory for enduring character over petty, localized tyranny. Have they made any gesture of kindness that changed a life? Leave a little heart if you believe that love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment, "Love is priceless," if you also believe in human union.